Welcome to another edition of An Afternoon with the Author, sponsored by the Nisei Veterans Memorial Center. Good afternoon. My name is Deidre Teagarden. I'm your host today, and we are so thrilled that all of you are joining us for this conversation with Gail N Harada, the author of Beyond Green Tea and Grapefruit. Before I get to introducing our speaker today, just wanted to let you know, as always, we love taking your questions. So just pop them in that little question and answer box at the bottom left of your screen as they come to you, and we will get to as many as possible. Also, this is being recorded and will be available on our Nisei Veterans Memorial Center YouTube channel in about a week. So we welcome you to go there and check out other talks you may have missed or others that might interest you. And of course, we couldn't do this without the great support of all of you and our corporate sponsors. You saw their logos as you logged on the call today. So we hope you mahalo all of them with us. But again, it's wonderful to have you all here. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker so that we can get right into the conversation talking about her wonderful book. Gail N Harada was born in Honolulu and spent part of her childhood on a U.S. Army base in Japan. She has a BA degree from Stanford University and an MFA from the University of Iowa Writers Workshop. In 2000, she won a Pushcart Prize for her poem, A Meditation. Her work has been published in the Hawaii Review, in regular issues of Bamboo Ridge, and in the following anthologies: the 2000 Pushcart Prize 24, Breaking Silence, an anthology of contemporary Asian American poets; Talk Story, an anthology of Hawaii's local writers, Wahine o Hawaii; and Island Fire, an anthology of literature from Hawaii. She has written poems for films and art projects. Painted Passages was a part of a video collaboration with noted Hawaii artist Noi Tanigawa and filmmaker Robert Pennybacker. And Journeys to the Horizon was written for Living Your Dying, the 2003 documentary about Reverend Dr. Mitz Aoki and his work with terminal cancer patients. She did a mixed media piece juxtaposing her poem, A Question, with medical bills, chemotherapy records, and newspaper accounts of the Iraq War dead for the 2006 Koa Gallery exhibit, Witnessing. She is a 2021 recipient of the Loretta D. Petrie Award for Outstanding Service to the Literary Community of Hawaii, and a very humble individual, I must say. We've had a few conversations. Can't wait to talk more to her. Please help me welcome Gail Harada. Gail, welcome.
Thank you so much, Deidre, for such a wonderful introduction.
Well, thank you. And, we just mentioned your Loretta Petrie Award, and this was presented to you, I think 2 Saturdays ago, as part of the Hawaii Film or the Hawaii Book and Music Festival, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, so congratulations.
Thank you. I feel very honored. I was totally surprised by the award. I didn't expect it at all.
Well, it was very nice. I think it was Scott Kikawa who introduced you and gave some lovely remarks about your writing and your service to the community. So obviously very well deserved, and congratulations again.
Thank you.
All right, so let's just jump right into your background. Your background's very interesting. You grew up between Japan and Hawaii. Talk to us about that and the impact that that had on you, both as an individual and as a writer.
Okay. I was born in Hawaii, and then when in the middle of first grade, my father's job took him to Japan. He was an electrical engineer for the Army, and we went to live on a US Army base. And at the time, I don't think I was unhappy, but I know that apparently my behavior in school changed. I was apparently kind of a chatterbox when I was in Hawaii, and then we moved to Japan, and then I just clammed up in class, and I only spoke if a teacher called on me. I refused to raise my hand, but I didn't feel unhappy, and it continued to be kind of an issue. I think if it were today, a child psychologist probably would have been called in. But like I said, I didn't feel unhappy. I guess for some reason, I just didn't feel like raising my hand anymore. And in growing up on the Army base, I think was, it kind of had the seeds of what I became interested in writing about, because it was kind of an unusual thing to be Japanese on base when most of the people off base were what my parents would call the Japanese nationals. There were some other Japanese Americans and Asian Americans on base, but not very many. Also, to me, the fence between the Army base and the rest of the Japanese community was very significant. So I did write a poem about that, about feeling like I wasn't, that I was conscious that I was inside the fence and the other Japanese were outside the fence. And in a way, I think growing up on the Army base made me feel like I was a part of American kind of culture and society, and also a part of Japanese culture and society, although the Japanese were different from Hawaii Japanese. So it just kind of, this identity thing got to be, it just became part of my identity to think of being, Japanese from Hawaii, not Japanese from Japan, which was a different thing.
Big difference. How long did you spend in Japan altogether?
About close to 5 years. So I moved to Japan in the middle of first grade, and then we moved back to Hawaii in the middle of 5th grade. So, and that was the other thing about, going to an Army school. People just left in the middle of the year. So,
right.
It's like, as I was in elementary school, I would have friends, and then they would just kind of disappear because their fathers had been transferred somewhere else.
Very transient.
Yeah, very transient. But like I said, I didn't feel unhappy because actually my parents would take us out of the base and would go visiting different places in kind of off base in the regular Japanese community. And my parents could do that because they spoke Japanese and they felt comfortable doing that. although what they discovered was the Japanese they spoke was not the Japanese spoke.
Right.
Yeah, so that was kind of an interesting thing.
That is an interesting phenomena, isn't it? Well, let's talk a little bit more about your parents. So your father was in Japan because he was an electrical engineer, but when, how, and your parents took you off base to try to get you more acclimated to Japanese culture, but talk a little bit more about your parents. I know we're going to talk about your father a little bit later in the interview, but talk a little bit more about growing up with them in Japan and Hawaii.
Okay, so I think also, well, I wanted to just talk a little bit about the other thing that was really kind of significant to me when we moved to Japan. I think, I don't know if living on the Army base made me more conscious about the world outside, because I remember the weekly reader was a big deal. And so I would, learn about current events, and I really was interested in that. I don't know if I was so interested when I was, back in Hawaii. And I think also because at the time, we had those duck and cover drills, which seemed more relevant because we were in Japan. And, Japan had been, had the atomic bomb dropped on them.
So what years were you there? Actually, let's.
About was 1959 to 60. So it was early 60s, basically. And my parents, at that time, we didn't fly back to Hawaii. You just go. The only person who flew was my father because he had that temporary duty. So he would fly back to Hawaii or to other places in Asia. But my brother and mother and I, basically we just stayed in Japan until we were moved back to Hawaii.
Those are very formative years that you were there.
Yeah, I think that's why I think, in retrospect, I think it really affected my interest in identity and cultural identity, but also my interest in what's going on in society. And part of that was my father, because he talked about it to me, at various times. So I'll talk a little bit about my parents. My father was Nisei, and his family was from Yamaguchi-ken. And of course, he joined the 442 basically straight out of high school. I think he might have lied about his age and actually joined before he graduated, because I found out he got a GED after he, finished with the service. So he obviously didn't get a high school diploma. And so that was, my father was Nisei because his parents had immigrated, but my mother was actually sort of a half Yonsei, because half Sansei, because my grandfather, her father, had been born in Pepe'ekeo. So he was actually born in Hawaii. And my grandmother was, it was an arranged marriage. She was from Niigata. That's where his family was from, originally, Niigata. So that side of the family is Niigata. And because my grandfather was born in Hawaii, his Japanese wasn't very strong, I think. And also, he spoke Japanese, but because he grew up in Pepe'ekeo, he used a lot of Hawaiian words and pidgin words. So I didn't know the difference. So I thought it was all Japanese words or English words. It's like, it was just all the same to me. And so when I went to Japan and I, was playing with the kids at school, a lot of times they didn't understand me because I was using Hawaiian words and Pidgin words. And I thought there's something wrong with them because they didn't understand what I was saying. I thought, what's the matter? They don't understand English or what? But actually, I was the one who was speaking words that were not English, you know.
Funny.
So, yeah. And so both my parents went to McKinley High School, but my mother was younger. So they didn't actually meet until after the war, after he had gone, you know, he got his GED, he went to UH, and then he went for an engineering degree because I think UH didn't have an engineering program at that time, or at least not electrical engineering. He went to Illinois Institute of Technology and stayed there for, I guess it must have been 4 years because, you know, people
Right.
didn't travel back then. You just go someplace and you just stay until you're
Right.
done and you come back.
Wow.
And so he had a funny story about going to Illinois Institute of Technology. He said that he saw all the other students with these, like, you know, little sticks on their belts, and he thought they were daggers. So he thought, oh, Chicago really is tough, you know, like the movies, I guess,
Right.
because they all have daggers. And then he found out those were slide rules. And
How funny.
yeah, so I guess he didn't really know about slide rules until he went there.
Wow. Interesting. You know, when you were growing up in, you know, going between the two cultures, whether it was really physically or just mentally, do you think that's when you started getting interested in writing? Did you journal a lot as a child?
No, I didn't think about being a writer. I was a reader. So
You're a reader.
I read everything I could get my hands on. But I never thought about writing until later. But I do remember, you know, things like for art class, we would be told to draw flowers and the other kids would be drawing daisies or something else. And I would be very busy trying to draw hibiscus. Because the hibiscus, to me, that was Hawaii. So, you know, those little things, I think, were the kind of the seeds of my interest in this place, basically.
Right. So let's go on to your book, the one that we're talking about today, Beyond Green Tea and Grapefruit. First of all, let's talk about the title. I love the title. Tell us why you chose that title.
Okay. The title comes from the last lines of the first poem, which is called A Meditation. And the reason I chose it for the title was just in my head. I felt like green tea represented Japanese culture in a way, you know, because of tea ceremony and all that. And grapefruit to me was 1960s American culture because I had never seen a grapefruit until we went to Japan. And of course, my mother got grapefruit from the commissary. And it was a very popular diet food, I guess, at the time. And it had such a unique taste, you know, that it just stood out to me. And so the beyond part, what is, there's a Japanese culture and the kind of the American culture that I felt I was between or part of. I felt like I was both part of them, but also apart from them. It was kind of a weird thing. And the beyond is what's the last line of the poem is a caldera of so it's beyond the tranquility of green tea and grapefruit into a caldera of molten, fearless clarity. So that molten caldera I associate with Hawaii. And so it's like those three things are there. And because I didn't kind of, I feel like I'm kind of between those three things somehow.
Um, and the book itself is a beautiful combination of poetry and short stories. Why the combination of the two? Why was it important for you to do that?
Because I did both poetry and short stories. And poetry is like little snapshots. So some things feel like poems to me. And stories are, I enjoy stories. I enjoy characters and situations, putting them in situations. So I just had a bunch of stories and a bunch of poems, and it seemed to kind of work. And kind of the odd piece is the piece about my father in Gruyere, because that's not fiction and that's not poetry. It's nonfiction. It's basically memoir.
And speaking of that, I mean, between the poetry and the short stories, you cover everything from love to 911, 9/11 to cancer and infidelity and everyday life. Um, did you do these pieces at different times throughout at different periods throughout your life? I'm curious. It's an amazing collection of all these different things that everybody goes through, and you have such a way of being able to explain them. But were they in different periods of your life?
Oh, definitely, because I'm very slow. It takes me a long time to finish things. So I just had things and I was finishing them and collecting them. And then Bamboo Ridge, Daryl and Eric suggested making a collection. So I did. I wasn't really thinking about it that much. So, that's why it's just sort of spans such a variety of kind of subjects and
Yeah. I know you're going to do a couple of readings for us in a little bit, but before we do that, let's talk about the story about your father. It's an incredibly powerful story. Why don't you tell us about it?
okay. I my father passed away in 1997, and before that, he did go to the 50th anniversary of the rescue of the Lost Battalion. It was a big thing for the 442 veterans. And I'd seen pictures, but my parents didn't talk about it that much, except, what a good time they had seeing people. And then I went on sabbatical. I was teaching at KCC, and I decided it was time to try and get a sabbatical. So my sabbatical project was kind of a combination of looking at, literary, it was literature that I was possibly going to use in my classes, from the American writers who went to Paris. And also there was a mystery writer exhibit in Dublin. So I'd never been to Europe before. And I went with a very good friend who actually lived in Paris for a while. So she was very fluent in French. I understood some French, but I wasn't really fluent. And she said, my friend told me, why don't you go see Briere? Because she had a friend who lived near Briere. So I said, okay. So I met I decided to go and it was, I think someone suggested that maybe I ask Ted Tsukiyama who to contact. So he suggested Pierre Moulin. And so I met Pierre Moulin, and he gave me the name of someone and said that, this person was going on vacation, but this person would kind of let the other people at the mayor's office know I was coming. And so I went. I mean, I was very happy to have some idea of how to get in touch with people. But there was a mix-up when I got there. It was really kind of a fortuitous mix-up because the person who was supposed to take care of the arrangements, I guess she didn't tell the other person in the office that I was coming. So when I showed up, the adjutant mayor actually talked to me and he was very apologetic. No, it's okay. And he said, oh, he'll call the people that were supposed to take me on the tour. They have a kind of a committee. And in the meantime, I guess because the village is so small, the town is small, Pierre Canonica, Mr. Canonica, came to see, he said that he heard that there was a child of the 442 at City Hall. And so he wanted to see me. So, chatted, and then he asked me if my father had been to the 50th reunion. And I said, yeah, my father had been. And he said, oh, he looked for the people that when he was 17, he was a guide for the 442 soldiers to go up into the forest to find the lost battalion. And he had a book that he had them sign, when at the 50th reunion, he was looking for people who he thought might have been in the group that he led up. So he said, oh, I'll go home 10 minutes, and so he went home. He came back with this big book, and it was I guess it was a military book that someone named Orville Sherry had written. And the second half of the book is just the names of all the 442 soldiers and what their ranks were and what companies they were in. And I didn't know what company my father was in. So he said, oh, just look. So I kind of opened the book. I turned a couple pages and it went straight to the page where my father's signature was. And it was just so amazing. It was just unbelievable. And of course I started crying and because there was my father's signature. So I can hold up my.
I mean, that must have just been have so many emotions. So yeah, in your book, it's on page 71. If you hold that up. Yeah.
So
there was his signature.
It's his signature, and so he didn't talk very much about what happened. I mean, in my in finding my father in Briere, I talk about the few times he did talk about things that happened to him while he was in the 442. But I didn't find out until I looked at the book later in the back, because it had all the medals that the different soldiers had been awarded. And one of the medals he had been awarded was for being a paratrooper and parachuting in, to a battlefield. So.
What an emotional time for you. And at the end of your story, you say, I can only imagine what happened to my father the first time he went to Briere. The last time he was there, he left his signature for me to find.
Yeah.
Ah,
It was, it was just so, it was just so unbelievable and so incredible.
um, the whole story, and for you, the whole story is very emotional. And you know, you also had the opportunity to find out what the acronyms next to his name had meant after all these years. Um, uh, have you, you know, have you kept in touch? Have you done any more research, or have you let it be where it is with the story?
I'm thinking about doing more research. Um, and Monsieur Canonica passed away um, a few years ago. Um, but I was able to send him my book so he could see that his picture was there.
How fortuitous it was that there was a mix up that day.
Yes. And that, you know, he just happened to have this book that and happened to, you know, years before gotten signatures. And so that's also the other thing that really impressed me about Briere was how wonderful the people who lived there are, who remember, who were there when the Lost Battalion was rescued by the 442 and who sort of witnessed what happened to the soldiers. So they were very, they really admired the 442, but they also were very critical of the military that would send the 442 into such a terrible situation from which, you know, they knew many would be lost.
Indeed. And there were so many losses. Would you do a few readings for us?
Okay, I guess I'll just read two poems. The first poem is called A Question. And one of the things that I talked about, you know, in elementary school, I was really into the weekly reader and kind of current events. And that kind of stayed with me, that kind of connecting or being interested in what's going on in the world. And somehow that creeps into what I write about, even though it's set in Hawaii a lot of times. So a question. I learned the vocabulary of cancer to comprehend the cancer of others. Then it disrupted my own life. The biopsy results of the suspicious abnormality arrived a day after Thanksgiving, 2004. The news was not good. There was a war in Iraq, trouble everywhere, and I had cancer. It didn't make sense. The network news coverage, the phone call from the doctor, all sounds dissolving into white noise, words being scribbled on sheets of paper, whirling beyond my grasp. I learned the terminology of pathology, invasive ductal carcinoma, grade 3, stage 1, estrogen receptor negative, HER2 negative. The most significant of 30 plus factors measured and assayed after the lumpectomy and sentinel lymph node biopsy. I was drafted into the war on cancer. The next assault was high-dose radiation therapy twice a day for 5 days, each session concluding with the technician scanning my body with the Geiger counter and cheerful banter with the radiologist and nurse. Then I learned the uncomfortable details of chemotherapy, and the language of cancer insinuated itself into each day, echoing the words of war: fight, battle, destroy, kill, resembling the jargon of war in technical specificity and distance. Prognostic significance is unfavorable. Numbers became critical code about blood and body. Medical terms and pharmaceutical names became familiar as the weather: neutropenia, adriamycin, cytoxin, Zofran, Ativan, Palmazine, Neulasta. The acronyms of the Iraq War, WMD, Weapons of Mass Destruction, IED, Improvised Explosive Device, drifted through the haze between the chemo treatments, floated in the alphabet soup of cancer. RBC, red blood cells, WBC, white blood cells, ANC, absolute neutrophil count. War was being waged against cancer in my body, and a war was being fought far away on foreign soil, charted by numbers, coded by acronyms. The October 26, 2005 New York Times noted a milestone. Officially 2,000 American dead, unofficially an estimated 30,051 Iraqi dead, witness to what we only glimpsed on television, the grim events of war, the daily numbers of deaths, locations, causes, documented by a timeline that resembled a hospital monitor screen dotted with tiny maps multiplying like small tumors on the page. War is cancer, and cancer is war. When and how will it end? Okay. The second poem I'm going to read is much lighter. It's called The Legacy, and it's about my father's car, basically. So this is The Legacy. It's the beginning of rush hour on Kapiolani Boulevard in front of the Blue Dolphin Lounge across Cutter Chevrolet on Friday the 13th, when the front of my car explodes and smoke or maybe steam pours out from under the hood. The service station guy I call sends a tow truck, but I can hear in his voice what he's thinking. What's this Wahine talking about? Exploded. Probably just one hose pulled out. Exploded? Nah, she just exaggerating. The next day he calls and says, son of a gun, it really was one explosion. Get one big hole in the radiator. One big chunk got blown out. Never seen anything like it before. Son of a gun. So I think, is it a sign? A message from my father via his silver Subaru Legacy? I feel moderately guilty, even though I did change the timing belt and I did have the CV boots replaced, and I do take it once a month to full serve. This time it's going to be expensive. This time it's going to cost big bucks. The service station guy points out, still cheaper than buying a new car. My anxious friends say, better to be safe. New cars are more reliable. The service station guy says, new cars break down all the time. My friends say, what kind of car could you get? The Toyota Echo is cute. You don't have to haggle for a Saturn. But I think of the fact that my father's car is a Subaru Legacy, a legacy. The name reverberates with meaning. Did the legacy blow up because of something I'm failing to do? Is this some kind of car bachi, an admonition? Or is it a sign that I need to let the car go? My father's silver Legacy is pragmatic, with reinforced side doors and solid engineering. The car my father took fishing, that he could load a kayak onto, stick a cooler into, haul fish and taco home in. When he went places with my mother, they used her sleeker Camry instead. After my father passed away, we found his Legacy didn't have much resale value, so I sold my car and adopted his. It doesn't match you, my mother said, turning her critical eye on me as I fastened the seatbelt, ready to drive the Legacy away from her house. It's not feminine, and it's not a very nice color. A car is not a fashion accessory, I replied, sliding the key into the ignition. It takes a month to fix the car this time. The mechanic replaces the damaged radiator, thermostat, upper hose, lower hose, bypass hose, transmission, cooler hoses, hose clamps, gaskets, PCV valve, ignition wire set, and spark plugs. And while testing the car, discovers what caused the explosion. Both radiator fans are broken. The dealer has only one fan in stock for a 12-year-old Subaru Legacy and special orders another fan, which takes 21 days to arrive from Japan via California. Is this a sign, a warning? Let go of the car or keep fixing it? Is it a message from my father? What would he say? He would say, it's just a car.
I love that. Both of the pieces are so different and so compelling. You know, throughout the book, you have a lot of World War II references. There's also the story about the RCA man that you have in there. But your father didn't talk a lot about his experiences in World War II. But did other people in the community, did they talk? Did you overhear stories when they all got together? How about that?
I didn't seek out World War II veterans to talk to. So I don't know why that RCA man suddenly decided to tell us that story, you know, my office mate and me, one day. So that was really interesting to me, but I don't know why he decided to do that. When I was teaching, I had a student, a World War II vet, Mauricio Teraoka, and he was responsible for the cactus garden at KCC, but he also loved writing. And he took my creative writing course several times just because he liked poetry. And he actually made a little poetry tree in the cactus garden, would ask people to write poems and hang them there. So he was kind of a gruff guy, but he just loved writing. And sadly, he passed away earlier this year. And I had chapbooks that he had made of his poems, because one of the projects was to turn in a chapbook of poems that were written for specific assignments for the class. And I assumed that he gave his family copies because he did them, you know, Xeroxed and with pictures. And so when I found out he passed away, I contacted his son, and I found out they didn't know about those chapbooks that he had made. So I packed them up and decided, you know, these belong with the family. And in those chapbooks, he wrote a lot about growing up on plantation on the Big Island, but he also wrote some stories about and poems about World War II. And one of his poems was published by Bamboo Ridge in issue 100. And it was about learning how to play an accordion from German prisoner of war. And he, you know, his other poems, he wrote some other, but they weren't published by Bamboo Ridge. But I thought it was interesting that, you know, he had this, he probably didn't talk about it too much with his family, but he wrote things down for himself.
So maybe that's a lead into this question about what can poetry give to us that maybe a novel or a short story doesn't. Can you talk about that?
I think poetry, I think people get intimidated by poetry because they don't understand it. But poetry, I think, is about, well, I like poems that make me feel something or give me a little flash of insight about something. So poetry is like a little snapshot of a moment or a memory or some little or a person. And I think poetry can kind of give you that little flash of insight or that little some sort of evoke some kind of feeling that maybe you can't really articulate all that well, but when you see a poem that does that, you understand that feeling, or you connect to it somehow. And so I don't, that's part of what I enjoy about poetry. I don't do a lot of form, rhyme and meter. I like the sound of natural language, although, of course, the music of natural language is really dependent on how things sound also. So I think that's what poetry can, it can give you like little insights, it can evoke feelings. Even if you don't really understand a poem, sometimes there's something about it that just kind of grabs you.
Well, I think, when we were talking about having you on as the author, and we were selling your book at the center, of which we have a few copies left if anyone's interested, people picked it up and they said, oh, it has poetry in it. How do I read poetry? And I thought, that's a great question. How is one supposed to read poetry?
I think you just read it with an open mind and don't feel like you have to understand it totally. And don't feel bad if you don't like a poem and you don't want to read it again. You just move on to the next poem. So poetry can be so powerful, and people just have to not be so intimidated by it, and just I think one of the things that I always look for in a poem is how I feel at the end of the poem. So the end of the poem is really a key to me. So even when I write poems, I have a hard time with the end, because I feel like the end, the end of the poem is so important to kind of the effect of the poem, whether that poem really will evoke a feeling or a response in the reader. And or show, give the reader maybe a new way to look at something, or a different way to look at something.
That's good to know. That's good to know. It's good to know that you can kind of just take it in as it comes, and you don't have to read them all at once, write one right after another, and just enjoy them. No stress. Mm-hmm. So you're a big proponent, of course, of reading local authors, writing about local topics. Talk to us about the importance of supporting the local writing community, and supporting and talking about the local community in one's writing.
I think there's so many voices and so much material that people can write about, that's related to Hawaii, that it's important that people actually read what's being written and see if there's anything that kind of appeals to them, or that they want to kind of share with other people, because part of the excitement of reading is sometimes being able to share something, your enthusiasm for something with other people that who might also have a similar enthusiasm. And I think if people don't write down things, they're lost. They could be lost. So it's important for people to read, but also to write things. And people who don't write, by reading what other people write, you're supporting the writer and helping that writer continue to explore this place, basically,
Right.
and the stories of this place.
Those are very important. We have a few questions. One is from Noi Tanigawa. Everybody knows Noi Tanigawa. She says, great poems, well read, thank you. Can you talk about interests you have, talk about interests you these days, what interests you these days? And also, you've begged students to edit. You do so much of it yourself. Any tips on editing? So tips on editing and talk about what interests you these days.
Oh, Noi is so, she just wants to torture me. No. What I'm interested in these days, I think I'm writing more political things, and also thinking about writing pieces about about the past and my parents, maybe my grandparents, and also maybe playing with fiction a little bit more, because fiction, I love poetry, but you can do other things with fiction. So what I enjoy, or what I find interesting about stories, is that you can choose a character and put that character in a situation, and then you can make a story. I mean, it's really hard. I mean, to me, it's really hard. It's complicated. Because it's not just a little insight into something. It's like getting the plot to work, getting everything to work. And so I'm kind of toying with the idea of, the last story in the book is, it's a kind of a murder mystery, but it's just the beginning. And my intention was to actually turn it into a novel, but I haven't gotten very far. So it's kind of stuck where it is now. So maybe that's something I'd like to kind of play around with, and maybe totally transform it, because I was thinking of different ways to approach it. As far as editing goes, I don't have any editing tips except you can look up almost any grammar problem on the web now. And I think one of the best ways people can edit themselves is just by reading what they write out loud. Because when you read what you write out loud, you hear what it sounds like and whether it can sound better. And I think that's one of the best, self-editing things that that I do. If I read it silently, I don't catch things. But if I read it out loud, that's when I see, oh wait, this word just doesn't sound good, or this sounds funny.
Right. That's a good tip. Okay, so let's see. Scott Kikawa says, yes, Gail, we need to see your murder mystery. Daryl Lum says, Waiting for Henry is one of the best stories ever. Buy the book and read them. Sorry about my poor pigeon on that. And Daryl also started off earlier in the talk today and said, hope that you'll read Meditation, which is the first poem you referenced at the beginning of the talk. So I don't know if you'd like to read that, or if you'd like to read it at the end as we close out. Up to you.
Oh, I could read it now.
Okay, read it now.
Okay. A meditation. A man contemplates the distance to the horizon from the place he stands on the reef in the break and surge of seawater and foam. He fathoms the near water, searching through its infinite shifting for the lightning glimmer of fish scales or the teal blue turning of an uhu, or the fluid shadow of a school of mullet gliding like one body, quick and elusive, poised to cast his throw net into the encroaching twilight tide on the edge of Waikiki. What do the waves tell him? How does the wind speak? When does the universe hum inside a man? A woman listens for something true in the waves and wind, trying to discern words which could resonate in her body and heart, like lines of an ancient chant, a mele moving her beyond the tranquility of green tea and grapefruit into a caldera of molten, fearless clarity.
It's beautiful. Thank you.
Oh, and I did want to say the cover of the book is by Noe Tanigawa.
Is it? I did not know that. You know what? Noe, for those who don't know, is just an amazing artist, isn't she?
Yes, she's amazing.
She really is. And I know she's done some things for Nisei veterans, some interviews with some of our individuals. And I found she even had a website a few years ago with some of her work, and it's worth checking out.
Yeah, and the drawings in the book are also hers. That
Very
separate
beautiful.
section.
So talented, Noe Tanigawa.
Yeah.
And you, Gail Harada. As we kind of close out today's talk, I want to thank everybody for being here. Gail, I'm going to come back to you in just a moment for some closing remarks, but wanted to thank everybody else for being here and let you know what's coming up. Our next afternoon with the author is going to be November 20th, and that is going to be with Marilyn Chase. She is the author of Everything She Touched, the story of Ruth Asawa. But before that, we have Leonard Oka speaking next week on our Nisei narrative. He will be talking, he's one of our co-founders of the Nisei Veterans Memorial Center, and we'll be talking on the legacy of the center and kind of where we're going from here. And next Saturday, we do have 2 in-person Ikebana workshops. So if you are interested and you are here on Maui, give us a call at the center. You know the number, it's on our website. Our website is nvmc.org. Please check it out and see what other events we have coming up, including our annual dinner and silent auction. The film producer and actor Lane Nishikawa is going to be our speaker for our annual dinner this year, which will also be on Zoom. You don't have to purchase anything to watch the Zoom webinar of the annual dinner. So again, check out that on our website. Sorry for all the updates today, but we have a lot coming up. So Gail, I'm going to take it back to you for some closing remarks.
Okay. Thank you so much for hosting this afternoon with an author. I really admire what the Nisei Veterans Memorial Center is doing to preserve stories and the legacy of the Nisei veterans. As far as I do want people to not be intimidated by poetry. And one way to think of it is, you know, poetry, I think what makes poetry hard is that you don't know the backstory of the poem. And that's why people, you know, feel like they don't get it because they don't know the backstory. Whereas a story, you know the whole story, you know the people, the plot, everything. But a poem, unless it has an epigraph, you know, a little quote at the beginning that gives you a little hint of what the theme is. If there is no backstory, I think people have to figure they themselves are the backstory. So whatever you bring to a poem, that is what will probably influence how you feel about a poem. And you shouldn't feel bad if you don't like a poem. A lot of poems I read I don't like. I'm not going to, you know, you don't have to dwell on it if you don't understand it, if you don't like it. You find what you do like, and then you figure out what it is you like. Is there a kind of image, something that the writer is doing in the poem that you like, the way they put words together? And that kind of helps you kind of access kind of the the poem and what it has to reveal to you. Because I think that's what is interesting about poems, is that they reveal something. And sometimes it's not what you expect.
Mhm. Thank you. All right, I appreciate that. We appreciate you for spending your afternoon with us, Gail. Thank you so much for being so gracious. Thank you for all the work that you do and for your all that you give back to the community. Mahalo to everybody for joining us again today. We hope to see you on one of our upcoming talks. Until then, be well, stay safe, ahui ho.
Thank you.